Greetings, science fiction lovers, and welcome to another in my series on classic science fiction novels that have influenced me. Today, we are going to be talking about a novel, a series of stories, which left a big impression on my younger self, as well as the world in general, and that is Isaac Asimov's I, Robot. Growing up in the 1960s and 1970s, I was captivated by on-screen portrayals of robots. Often these were one-of-a-kind metal and plastic creations, complete with flashing lights and whirling antennae, such as Robbie in Forbidden Planet or B9 in Lost in Space. They're kind of a parody of humanoid appearance. There were also the Cybermen in Doctor Who were more of an assembly line creation in appearance, although strictly speaking they were cybernetic organisms rather than robots. Some years later I would introduce myself to darker and more sophisticated robots such as Gort and Maria, and eventually the world of android creations such as Ash, Bishop, and cyborgs like the T-800, and many, many, many more, of course. A key element of many robot portrayals over the decades was the difference between what was a programmed machine, such as ED-209 in RoboCop, and robots that appeared to have the capability of individual personality and growth, such as an R2-D2 and C-3PO. And it's that discussion of the possibility of individuality of a manufactured mechanical creation that makes Isaac Asimov's robot stories so important. Not just important to science fiction, but in the ongoing development of advanced robotics and artificial intelligence that we see today. Now, I don't recall exactly the first time I read I, Robot. It was sometime in the very early 1970s as I was beginning my science fiction journey, but I do recall the impact it had on me, which was considerable. Earlier depictions of robots had often followed the dangerous machine created by mad scientist approach, but Asimov presented a portrayal of robots as theoretically beneficial creations that followed sophisticated logical rules which gave them dynamics and issues that were unique to them. First published in 1950, I, Robot is an anthology collection of 9 of Asimov's robot short stories, first published as far back as 1939 in magazines such as Super Science Stories and Astounding Science Fiction. Legendary but unseen publications to a young lad in Scotland, never seen but mentioned in dust jackets and science fiction history books. So, I, Robot was my first exposure to those stories. I should warn at this point that there will be spoilers ahead, and that generally speaking I will be talking about the stories as presented in the novel I, Robot, rather than the original short story versions that were published, as there are differences. The stories were resequenced and rewritten for the novel and were linked together with a narrative interview with Dr. Susan Calvin, a robo-psychologist at Asimov's in-universe creation, the US Robots and Mechanical Men Corporation. The Calvin figure allowed Asimov to explore the ethical, psychological, and technical issues surrounding robots' interactions with humans and each other. It's a foundational work, pun intended, which helped cement Asimov as one of the most influential figures, some would say the most influential, in science fiction. Many robot stories ever since have explicitly or implicitly referenced Asimov's themes, especially the famed 3 laws of robotics. And current debates over real-world robotics and AI are heavily influenced by Asimov. Asimov introduces several lasting ideas into the world of robots. the presentation of sentient robots as individuals rather than machine copies of humans. This is achieved somewhat by the introduction of another concept, which was the positronic brain or mind of the robots, made of platinum iridium. The concept of robopsychology was introduced, the science of understanding and addressing the mental processes of robots, and indeed the concept and term itself of robotics as a full-on scientific and industrial discipline was introduced. As mentioned, though, perhaps the most important creation of Asimov is the famous 3 laws of robotics, introduced explicitly in the story Runaround, presented as the second story in the book. The laws were implied in earlier published stories, and these stories, such as Reason and Robbie, were retooled in the book to include specific references to the laws. Asimov himself claimed that he didn't invent these, but merely formulated them in written form. But regardless, these laws have become rightly famous and continue to resonate today in our discussions on AI. So the laws themselves read as follows. Law 1. A robot may not injure a human being or, through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm. Law 2. A robot must obey the orders given it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. And Law 3. A robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. It's worth noting that later Asimov introduced a Law 0 or 0th law. I always find it hard to say that one, which says that a robot cannot cause harm to humanity or allow humanity to come to harm through inaction, as opposed to specific individuals, humanity as a group. This law is not explicitly outlined in the iRobot novel, but Susan Calvin does discuss its principles in the final story, The Evitable Conflict. And this law also features in the crossover with Asimov's Foundation universe. The Evitable Conflict is a superb example of Asimov's exploration of the impact on humanity of widespread use of robots and intelligent machines, and the consequences. In it, the global economy is run by these machines, but Calvin, while exploring anomalies that have arisen, discovers that those machines are guiding humanity for its own good. What of the free will of humanity, given this supposed benevolent control? This was deep stuff for my younger self to absorb, and indeed still is today. Being the last story in the book, it's also a good indication of how each story successively builds on Asimov's world through the novel, starting with a story of a robot impacting an individual human, Robbie. And I can't help but think while reading that about your plastic pal who's fun to be with. Through stories about robots used for industrial and space exploration, potential robot politicians running entire countries, and then ending at robot control over humanity. And despite these stories being written 80 years ago, this rings true. Once the robot and AI genie is out of the bottle, who knows what the impact will be, other than it won't go back in the bottle. That relationship with humanity will continue to evolve regardless. There are all sorts of fascinating ethical dilemmas and logical problems explored. How do robots deal with paradoxes introduced by the 3 laws, such as in the story Runaround? What happens when a robot begins to worship an energy converter rather than serve its human authority in the story Reason? Can robots form their own faith and belief systems? In Liar, a psychic robot causes turmoil when he lies to humans about what he sees in their minds rather than cause them emotional harm, but this paradoxically also causes problems. Catch That Rabbit explores what happens when robots control other robots and the practical effects and problems of robot teams. Little Lost Robot explores the dangers of tampering with the first law of robotics, something that was explored occasionally by Asimov in later stories, and the danger of messing with that prohibition. In Escape, we explore the logical processes behind a supercomputer circumventing the second law of robotics in order to create a hyperspace drive. Now, I love the story Evidence, in which a politician is suspected of actually being a robot. Now, without physical examination, how can you tell? Would a human adhering to the principles of the three laws appear to be a robot as much as a robot would appear to be a human? If the robot is sentient and sufficiently advanced, then indeed, what is the difference between robots and humans? And is morality universal? And finally, the aforementioned The Inevitable Conflict, where truly global philosophical concepts are examined. The book is a genuinely groundbreaking collection, and Asimov would go on to develop his robot world with further original novels and an eventual crossover into his Foundation series, but that's the topic for another video. Anyway, thanks very much for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed this glimpse into another science fiction classic. Please leave a like and a comment if you enjoyed it, and consider subscribing. But until next time, stay well and keep looking to the future.